Thank you for joining us today. My name is Keith Larson, and I'm the president of the Louisville Forum. The Forum typically meets on the second Wednesday of every month at Vincenzo's Restaurant in downtown Louisville, but these days we're meeting on Zoom. The Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group founded in 1984. We host debates and discussions of current and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the forum, or if you're interested in becoming a member, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Our topic today is a fiscal shot in the arm. How should Louisville spend its $388 million stimulus funds? Just 2 days ago, the U.S. Treasury released its guidance on how cities like Louisville can and cannot use the funds from the American Rescue Plan. Joining us today to unpack this guidance is Councilman Bill Hollander, who is the chair of the Metro Council's Budget Committee, Councilman Kevin Kramer, vice chair of the Budget Committee, and the mayor's office. For the mayor's office, we have Margaret Handmaker, who is the executive director of Louisville Accelerator, which is an effort to work with cities, agencies, and partners to guide the spending. The panel will primarily consist of these three speakers, although Ms. Handmaker brought with her members of the mayor's staff who may be able to answer specific questions. And these guests include Rebecca Flyshaker, Director and Co-Chief, Louisville Forward, Keith Talley, the Mayor's Strategic Operations Officer, Eric Burnett, Senior Policy Advisor, and Jeff O'Brien, Director and Co-Chief of Louisville Forward. Here to moderate our panel today and help us ask questions is Marcus Green with WDRB News. At this point, I'll turn it over to the three panelists for some brief opening remarks. And then Marcus, please feel free to jump right in with questions. So Councilman Hollander, would you like to kick us off?
Be happy to. Thank you, Keith, and thank you to the Louisville Forum. When Keith and I discussed today's event, we knew there was a possibility that we would get the first federal guidance on how this money could be used shortly before the event. We didn't know that it would come in a 151-page document that we are all still trying to digest. So I'm sure there are questions we won't be able to answer about how we can use the funds. I know there are questions we can't answer about how we should use the funds, in part because we want to hear from the public. What we do know is that we will be receiving $388.3 million in two tranches, one probably this week and the next a year from now. That's a little bit smaller amount than we had anticipated from some preliminary spreadsheets that were circulating about the dollars coming to Louisville. We know that the money needs to be obligated by the end of 2024. We learned this week that we will have 2 more years to complete construction projects that are obligated and funded by the end of 2024. And that's an important point that may allow us to do some construction projects, particularly, in my view, in the housing area. We also learned that there is broad flexibility on how the funds can be used. It's not unlimited, but it's much broader than was the case with the previous relief cities received during the pandemic, CARES Act funding. There are 4 broad allowed categories. Lost public revenue. We can use ARP money to replace revenue we lost during the pandemic. While our revenues held up better than we expected, tax receipts, particularly net profits and employee withholding to a lesser degree, are down. And they're particularly down when you consider the growth that we expected without the pandemic. We can recover that lost public revenue. We can deal with the public health response. They can be used for vaccination programs, COVID-19 testing, contact tracing, and buying personal protective equipment, as well as monitoring for variants of the coronavirus. We can deal with negative economic impacts. Governments can use the money to aid people, businesses, and government units affected by the pandemic, probably including our tourism industry. We could use it to pay essential workers, supplementing the pay of people, particularly with emphasis on lower income workers, according to the guidance. We can use it for particular infrastructure projects, but they are limited, including drinking water, sewer, broadband projects, with flexibility to choose those as the highest priority for our community. And we can use it to assist the hardest hit communities. In low-income areas, we can invest the funds in childcare programs, tutoring, affordable housing developments, housing vouchers, and violence prevention efforts, all of which we need in Louisville. I read that guidance to allow very broad flexibility in this category. Some things are explicitly not allowed. We can't use the funds to cut taxes, to add to our rainy day fund, or for general infrastructure needs, or to put into pension accounts. It's important to remember that the $350 billion for state and local governments is a small part of the American Rescue Plan. There is separate money for eviction prevention, for small business, especially restaurants, and for others. I hope that we can use some of the local funds to make sure that everyone in Louisville knows about and can access those pots of money. The program Metro Council recently passed to provide attorneys for those facing evictions is specifically allowed to be funded with ARP funds, as we anticipated and as we were very happy to see in the guidance. An obvious use of the funds is to deal with the health issues, as I mentioned. Using funds to replace lost revenue will help get our budget back in shape and invest in programs we need, including in the public safety area. Beyond that, and I'm speaking for myself here because there are 26 members of Metro Council and there's a whole community that should weigh in on this. My goal would be to use the funds in a way that we can look back in 10 years and say we made a real difference for the community, doing things we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. In the area of housing, for example, these funds would appear to allow us to really chip away at tremendous needs for tens of thousands of housing units, including for our houseless neighbors. We have people living on our streets today who have housing vouchers, but we have no housing to put them in. I hope we can change that and match other ARP funds for homeless services with safe, decent places to live. We have people who could find better jobs and better futures with education that is beyond their financial reach right now. For example, having a Class A commercial driver's license is extraordinarily valuable, but the cost of the training can be several $1,000s, funds that many people just don't have. We could permanently change lives by funding that sort of workforce training. We could also fund and expand the very successful Code Louisville program to get people into high potential software development careers. We know that broadband is just as important as any other kind of infrastructure and that it's lacking in some of our poor neighborhoods and also in some rural areas in Jefferson County. We can change that with an investment in those communities in broadband. We can fund programs to provide early childhood education so that we can improve literacy for kids and have fewer kids coming to JCPS schools who are not ready for kindergarten and who find it difficult or impossible to ever catch up. Those are just a few of the examples that I would be interested in and that I hope we have a discussion about in the community. We obviously need and want to hear from the entire community, and we look forward to a broad discussion about how to seize what is really this remarkable opportunity.
Councilman Kramer, do you want to jump in?
What looks to be an interesting year. So just 3 years ago, the Metro Council was told that we needed to raise $80 million in new taxes on our residents or the sky would fall. We were told that our government was structurally imbalanced and that between pension obligations and deferred maintenance, there was no other way. Instead, the council took up the challenge, and rather than just asking the people for more money, we found efficiencies and were able to restore many of the cuts. The decision to look within wasn't the easiest route, but it has helped set us up to better take on the challenges that the Metro faces today. When COVID brought the start of the shutdown, we were in the middle of our budget process, and the mayor announced that we would have to use $46.7 million of our rainy day fund in FY20 and in FY21 to balance the budget if federal stimulus funds were not received. Federal stimulus funding was received in FY20 and FY21, but the council continued to focus on streamlining spending and set us on a path of having a $60 million surplus that the mayor has recommended we use in FY22 for additional programs and personnel. since last fall. It has been my hope that we would focus the use of this surplus on the biggest challenges facing Metro, deferred maintenance. Since the fall, I have been told to wait and that the budget is coming or that ARP money is coming. The budget is out and very little spending on deferred maintenance is there. If the council does not significantly modify the FY22 recommended budget, ARP will be our final opportunity to make the correct decisions and to use these funds to rebuild our city and to set us on a path for prosperity for generations to come. In 2016, the Metro Council endeavored on addressing our nearly $200 million in paving needs with an ambitious 10-year plan. Despite some tough budgets and a lack of commitment in a few proposals sent to the council, we are now working on our 6th year of meeting our goals. We've also made strides addressing sidewalk repairs that had been reported, some since before merger. The proposed FY22 budget funds those reported calls, so we can now begin the challenging task of funding an estimated $68 million throughout Metro on crumbling sidewalks. In 2016, Councilman Hollander and myself worked with council members to establish a complete understanding of the many deferred maintenance needs of Metro. That list totaled $2 billion and dealt with paving, parks, buildings, vehicles, heavy equipment, and facilities. This isn't the spending that gets votes. It's not the sexy stuff, but it does live up to the basic function of local government. The more than $400 million in relief received from the 2 federal aid packages must be spent in a way that either addresses immediate hardships people are facing due to COVID or on one-time expenditures that will address a current or future need. When we are accessing the spending proposals, we need to understand this funding will be here through 2024, and then it will be gone. We must not depend on it for routine operational costs. Otherwise, we will effectively be undoing the hard work of years past. Our parks were a place of refuge during the pandemic. Our sidewalks were where people took a break from their new at-home offices or at-home classrooms. Our libraries, neighborhood places, and health centers should have been places where people turn for help. We need to make sure that we use these funds to not only take care of their operational, but also their physical needs so that they can continue to serve the people of Louisville. If, when this process is complete and the money has been spent, we find ourselves with scaffolded buildings because of falling bricks, or a police headquarters where urine runs down the walls in the offices, or we have parks and libraries fully or partially closed due to lack of care and a budget crisis because we don't have the funds to keep all of the new positions that we had hired over the past couple of years, we will have failed to take this once in a generation opportunity to begin the healing process and show our next generation what good leadership looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Kramer. How about Ms. Handmaker? Would you like to go?
Well, the council members did a great job of outlining what the bill allows and what our needs are. So I'll just talk a little bit about process. I think that Louisville is probably ahead of a lot of cities because we can build on the thought leadership and community involvement in initiatives like Build Back Better Together and advancing racial equity. So let me talk about the team that I'm going to be leading, the Louisville Accelerator team. We have 3 major buckets of responsibilities. Number 1, build on the work that has already been done and gather additional input to provide information to the Metro Council and to the mayor, who will then recommend and approve how to move forward. Number 2, everybody wants results, good results, as Councilman Kramer just said. Our team will assist with project management. And then number 3, there is a lot of monitoring and compliance that is mandated. So we will collaborate with OMB to meet federal, state, and local requirements. I want to also mention that part of our job is to make sure that we coordinate with and leverage all other pots of money from programs or future legislation, such as an infrastructure plan. So as has been said, this may be a once in a generation opportunity for Metro Louisville. $388 million sounds like so much money, and it is. but we know there are billions of dollars of needs. So this is an opportunity, but it's also a huge responsibility. And I just want to mention one other thing. I've heard that there are rumors that there's already a secret plan for how to use the money. And I'm sure, and I'm hoping you'll say so, that our Metro Council members on this panel will join me saying, that's not true. And when we know more, we will tell you. So thanks very much.
Okay, now we're moving into the Q&A. So Marcus Green from WDRB, feel free to start the questions.
Well, thank you, Keith, and thank you for inviting me. It's a very interesting topic, and there's a lot to get to. We could probably have 4 hours of discussion about this, but we'll try to boil it down here to the next 45 minutes or so. I wanted to first start with Ms. Haymaker and just ask a question that I don't think has been answered yet. Do we know why Louisville's allotment was reduced from the previous estimate of about 434 million to the 388 that is actually coming to the city? Is there any reason for that we've been given as a city?
Yeah, there were, in the initial estimated allocations, there were cities and I think maybe some tribal units that were left out. So it just had to be, everybody had to reallocate to pick up the organization, the entities that had not gotten an allocation. It was nothing personal.
Thank you. And in terms of the process, you elaborated a little bit on this, Ms. Haymaker, but in terms of when the mayor named last week you to head the Louisville Accelerator team, he mentioned that you'll be working with a variety of public sector partners, private sector partners, business, foundation, nonprofit partners to draft some of these priorities from the mayor's administration. Can you elaborate at all on who will be sitting at that table, and can you pledge to make the list of those partners public so that the citizens of Louisville will understand who might be crafting these priorities as they get started in that process?
Sure, I have no problem with making everything public. And in terms of the people who will be at the table, there have already been all sorts of, as I said, thought leaders and stakeholders and community citizens who've been involved in work that has already been done. I have some of those lists. I have to mention I've been on the job for 2.5 days, which is why I have some team members here to help me. Jeff or Rebecca, do one of you want to elaborate a little more on Marcus's question?
Sure, I'll go ahead and take it. Jeff O'Brien with Louisville Forward, and I think Marcus, what we're, as Ms. Haymaker referred to, is we are building on some efforts that we had going on last year, and that would be the Build Back Better Together process and the Advancing Racial Equity process. And in those cases, we did have a number of community participants participate. I don't know if for this specific process that we've identified a specific list of stakeholders or a specific process. That is something that we are building right now. We were really waiting on that guidance document, which we received, but you can see some of the priorities that were laid out in those documents to really not just address the pandemic, but the social justice movement that was occurring in the city, and really some priorities that Metro have been facing. I think both council members mentioned the concerns about housing and the concerns in the community about the growing need for deferred maintenance. So now that we have that guidance, we're using those documents to help build that process and really identify who would be the key stakeholders to help guide this through, and not least of those would be working with the Metro Council on that process.
Well, and I'd like to ask Councilman Hollander and Councilman Kramer, from the council's perspective, how do you all plan to get involved with the administration in this, what could be a potentially very unwieldy process, identifying priorities, involving different stakeholders, and even I'd like to know, what role do you see the general public, even those who have not been involved in these other efforts from last year that Jeff O'Brien mentioned? What role do you see the public playing, and how significantly will you take the public input on how to spend this money? We'll start with Councilman Hollander, please.
Well, I think there will be considerable interaction with the administration and with the accelerator team and the council. Exactly what that format will take, I don't know, but there'll be involvement from the very beginning in that process. I hope there's broad public input. I mean, Councilman Kramer and I are going through the budget process right now. One of the things that I'm happy about in our regular budget is that we are really, in the last 5 years, we've changed the amount of public input that we have. We have public hearings where we invite members of the public to speak, which really didn't happen in a big way in the past. We have public online forums. We're hearing already from a lot of people who have sights on some of this money, and we're trying to evaluate whether those are allowable and whether they make sense for the community. So there's going to be significant council input and public input. There needs to be. And the good thing about this is we don't have to allocate this money next week or even next month or even in a few months. I mean, we have time to make good decisions, and we should make them.
Councilman Kramer?
Yeah, I concur with Bill's comments. I would point out that typically when it comes to spending Metro funds, it starts in the mayor's office, and then he offers proposals. In the past, we have offered advice and suggestions, and sometimes we feel like that's been well attended to, and other times it's felt like the numbers came across like, here it is. Having the fact that Margaret is sitting in this meeting with us today says that it feels like the mayor's intent is to include the council in these conversations. I will answer her question from my perspective anyway. If there are any plans for how to distribute these funds on the council side of the street, they've certainly not included me. So I anticipate conversations with the mayor's office. We've already begun that process, by the way, in conversations with the administration, myself and others, I'm sure. But from my perspective, I've already started to propose that we need to be careful how we do this. Much of what I shared with you in my opening comments would not have come as a surprise to anybody on the mayor's staff.
Well, and just to be clear, because in New Albany, for example, there's been a little bit of a row between the council and the mayor's administration there about how to spend this money. They actually approved letting the redevelopment commission, which is an arm of the administration, mostly appointed, not elected, decide how to spend its money. But just to be clear, in Louisville, the ultimate decision will be left to the Metro Council, or how do you all view that?
Yes.
Whoever wants to take that.
I'll take that. Yes. A grant that comes to Metro Louisville is always appropriated through Metro Council. There's no question that the expenditure of these funds will be approved by council.
So part of the job of my team, just to elaborate on that, is that there are so many things that we want to do, so many things that need to be done. And we do have to be realistic, though, in the way that the money is spent. So one of the things that we will do is going through all of this information, input, opportunities, proposals, and so forth. But we've got to look at feasibility, timelines, impact, amount of money that it will take, and give the Metro Council all of that information, and hard decisions will have to be made.
Well, and to that point, Ms. Haymaker, do you anticipate some sort of data-driven approach that will very clearly define some kind of numerical benefit to these projects? I can only imagine, with the sheer number of potential needs and wants, even with this money, that there will be a lot of entities and really a lot of projects that might be possibilities. So any plans to really refine the decision making, or at least the drafting process, by applying some kind of data-driven approach?
Well, since I worked for Mike Bloomberg, I'm all about data and evidence. And I don't know what the metrics might be, other than, as I mentioned, I mean, we have to know that a project's feasible, how long it will take, what kind of impact it might have, what kind of value that's going to add, short-term, long-term. So today, I can't give you metrics, but I will tell you it will be a highly data-driven analytic approach. Metro Council will be given a lot of information. And then, like I said, there are so many good projects, but hard decisions will have to be made. But I hope that we have a great deal of information. And I want to say again, picking how this money will be used is not necessarily the hardest part. I mean, we have to make sure that we get good results out of these projects. So there will be a great deal of project management, benchmarking, and so forth, to try to ensure good results. And the reality is, for things that haven't been done before, we will learn some things along the way and modify and learn and modify. And I consider that a learning, and we will share that. If we learn that there was something we didn't know and we need to change it a little bit, let's talk about that, because nobody else should do it either.
Marcus, let me, if I can add just on the project management side, some of the new positions in the mayor's proposed budget are project managers. It's an expansion of the Office of Performance Improvement, but it's really a project management office sort of creation. And I was in a meeting with Councilman Kramer where the mayor talked about this, and it got nods from everyone as in a positive sort of way. I mean, we saw with the much smaller amount of federal money that came to us through the CARES Act that just administering that kind of money takes some more people, and to do it well and to do it efficiently and to get the money out the door and to do it in a way that the public really will respect, you have to have people doing that. And so I think that kind of position we're going to need. I mean, it's you can't just drop $388 million into the city operation and say, spend this efficiently without having any additional people to help with that process.
Already there are several questions in the chat box that are asking about public participation and really some more details. You all have mentioned that the public will be involved, but can you say specifically what avenues might be available? Are we talking about an online portal, a questionnaire, in-person or virtual public hearings? What, as of today, are you all envisioning to truly gauge the public input from the community? Let's start with Ms. Handmaker, and then ask Councilman Kramer and finish up with Councilman Hollander, please.
We haven't put that together yet, but I definitely anticipate an online portal and reaching out to all of the people who have already been involved. And Mayor Fisher has talked about different advisory groups. So that's a this week and next week kind of problem for us to solve. At the same time, we need to move quickly. But I promise you there will be lots of input. I've become so popular. You're supposed to laugh at that.
I did.
You always have been.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's amazing what $388 million will do to your popularity.
Yes, for sure. I'm sure you're popular too.
Well, Councilman Kramer, I mean, how do you
Yeah.
envision, how would you,
Well,
in an ideal world, the council to solicit public input on this, on how I'm spending this money?
Well, I think first, Councilman Hollander mentioned that that we've tried to engage the public in the last couple of budget cycles. There's already a portal open for this budget cycle to remain open until the end of May. So we are actively soliciting. I think the other thing that quite often gets overlooked is when we merged governments back in 2002, 2003, we went from 12 members of the Board of Aldermen and 3 members of the county county commissioners. And I lived in the former county. There were 3 representatives for all of the county. We have 26 Metro Council members. I still shop, and every time I'm at the store, somebody stops me. And Ms. Handmaker, not as popular as you are, because $388 million makes a lot of difference. But I assure you, I didn't get in or out of the grocery store that someone didn't stop me and ask me questions about what was going on. I still go to church in the same community. I still, I'm still hanging out, and I go to my kids' ball games and my grandkids' ball games in the same parks. And so, we have a form of government that very deliberately made it possible for that public to have access to their council members. And so I think part of it is this portal. I know that's true. Part of it's going to be the mayor's efforts to reach out. But I think honestly, 26 council members in their districts, we're going to know, we're going to hear. It's very grassroots, very basic. That's the beauty of local government is we live in the neighborhoods we represent.
Let's talk a little bit about specific uses and projects that, while it may be early in this process, have already been identified or that you're hoping to move forward. Let's start with Councilman Hollander. You mentioned that you would like to have us look back in 10 or 15 years and say we made some significant transformational investments with this money. Are there things in particular, you mentioned housing, but perhaps more specific, what specific areas would you like to use this money on certain capital projects that might be transformational?
Well, I'll describe all of these as capital projects. I mean, I certainly agree with Councilman Kramer. You have to be very careful about creating new ongoing positions with essentially one-time money, and I don't think anybody wants to do that. But I think there are a number of things that we can do that are in the nature of capital projects. Some of them are buildings and other things, but some of them are investments in our people. I mentioned housing. I mean, to me, and we've put $56 million into affordable housing in the last 5 years, 6 years. There's another proposal to put $10 million into affordable housing. I think we've done some good work with that. But it's pretty astounding to me that we have houseless people with housing vouchers walking around and we have no place to put them. I mean, I think we can fix that. I think we can make significant moves toward that by building some affordable housing, particularly for our houseless neighbors. And I hope that's something that we really think about long and hard. I think workforce training is extremely important. And when I talk about, when you look back in 10 years, I mean, that's the kind of investment that's going to last for a long time. And it makes smart economic sense. It gets people into the workforce, they pay taxes, they become productive citizens or more productive citizens. So you know, if you talk to people like Michael Gritton, he will tell you that if we had money available for CDL licenses and the training that you need for that, several $1,000s, we could put people into that training immediately and get them into better jobs. The Code Louisville thing has worked extremely well for us. There's a plan to expand that as part of the proposed budget, but we can also clearly, I think, use ARP money for that expansion and maybe even a bigger expansion to get people into better situations. So again, I think those kind of investments are important. I think childhood education, early childhood education is very important. I mean, I worked with the chair porter of the JCPS a few years ago on a project in West Louisville, where we talked about how could we get kids in better situations when they get to school, more people who are kindergarten ready. And one of the ideas we had was, let's get library workers to take bookmobiles out to daycare centers, particularly in those impacted areas. Now, we bought one, and that actually was done with some private funds recently for the Louisville Free Public Library. We could expand that kind of program. And again, I think those kinds of things can make long-standing improvements in the community. That's when I talk about how when we look back in 10 years or 20 years and say, you know, you use that money well to make something really different. I think that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about.
Here's a question that's for both you and Councilman Kramer, but we'll start with Councilman Kramer. Do you have any concern that the money appropriated now will lead to required new spending in the future? If you make a transformational capital project investment, won't they need maintenance? And would this stimulus ultimately lead to bloated budgets? Councilman Kramer, would you like to start with that?
That's a great question, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to start with that one. That is my greatest concern when we look at what's coming. You know, when you talk about creating 5 new positions to look at for project management, for example, Councilman Hollander's right. We don't have the staffing right now to to monitor the types of projects that we need to do. So we're going to have to hire folks. Our challenge is going to be when we hire those 5 individuals, what are our expectations for those 5 individuals going forward? You know, are we hiring 5 career folks that 15, 20 years from now, we plan on continuing to employ them? Because if that's the case, then we're going to have to plan on continuing to build and continue to have projects for those guys, for those folks to monitor. So I think we need to be very, very careful as we talk about hiring new people, what we're hiring those people to do. And as far as the building, you know, and maintaining the buildings, I do think that we need to build some new buildings. But remember, deferred maintenance isn't necessarily building on new buildings. It's fixing buildings that we already own. And in many instances, we have put off repairs on some of these buildings, and that those delayed repairs are eventually going to break. And when they break, it's going to be more expensive to fix them then than it would have been to fix them now. So deferred maintenance doesn't create for you an ongoing expense. Actually, deferred maintenance reduces the likelihood of some tremendous unexpected expense going forward. Now, that said, make no mistake, every building that Metro owns, every road that we own, every sidewalk that we own requires maintenance. And as we build buildings, as we own roads, we need to take that into account. And again, the council about 6 years ago recognized that we were not doing a very good job of maintaining the roads. And we realized that the only way to get ahead of it was to put 10 million a year, and that will catch us up. That 10 million a year at the end of 10 years doesn't, 20 million, I'm sorry, at the end of 10 years, that doesn't mean we paid for roads, we're done. That means in 20 years, we can spend less on road maintenance than we had been spending. It won't need to be 20 million anymore, but we'll still have to maintain those roads. This is just a plan to get us on track. And then I would argue that we know we have $2 billion in deferred maintenance. This isn't new buildings, this is deferred maintenance. If we don't have a plan to take care of this in the not too distant future, and if we don't take advantage of what ARP offers as an opportunity, we will have to pay more in the long run than we would if we simply took advantage of the opportunity now, and fix those things.
Just very quickly,
Marcus.
if I can, Councilman Hollander, before I come to you, I want to just follow up with that. So Councilman Kramer, are you suggesting that the bulk of this money should be spent on deferred maintenance, or what percentage do you believe ought to be spent on deferred maintenance? Because clearly this legislation does target specific pandemic related issues first. So how do you envision breaking up this money so that you can balance the pandemic related needs with other things that are technically allowable under this bill?
Again, Marcus, that's a great question. Thank you. I don't know that I have a precise percentage per se. What I would say is this: as we look at this funding, we should be asking ourselves at every turn, is what we're spending this on a one-time expense? Are we creating positions that in future budgets we're going to have to pay for? And if that's a yes, then we better ask ourselves how we're going to pay for it in those future budgets, right? Undoubtedly, a good bit of this needs to be distributed to those who were most adversely affected by the pandemic, right? Even to the point of when you look at some of the nonprofits and the Bell of Louisville, for example, the Science Center, the zoo, there are places that their revenue took a huge hit as a result of COVID. It may be appropriate to use some of those funds in those areas. But even those organizations should understand this is a one-time replacement of income that they lost, right? Not something that they should expect to come back year after year after year, and we're going to be able to take care of them. It's one-time dollars, and any deferred maintenance we can get, man, I'd love to see us do it. But yeah, I think we have to take care of the immediate needs that were created by the pandemic first.
And Councilman Hollander, what kind of concerns, if any, do you have about potentially, even unwittingly, creating bloated budgets or positions that could result in additional spending down the road for the city?
Well, I think we have to be careful about that. I would say we have 5,000 employees in Metro. That's about 500 fewer than we had before. So if you add 5 positions to project management, you have a lot of people coming in and out. I don't think that's a position that you would have to lay somebody off potentially at the end of 2024 when the funding goes away. They can be absorbed into some other position. So, but clearly it's a concern, and you do not want to expand ongoing expenses in a significant way with this kind of money. I would say I think that the infrastructure needs, and I certainly share the concern. I co-chaired the committee with Councilman Kramer on infrastructure needs, and we know what they are. The mayor's talked about it. Margaret talked about it a few minutes ago. They're enormous from deferred maintenance in the community. I think when you read the guidance, that we are quite limited as to how we can use ARP funds for deferred maintenance. I believe we can use it potentially for infrastructure to the extent that we've had a revenue loss from the pandemic, but the guidance is actually quite clear. A general infrastructure project typically would not be included unless the project responded to a specific pandemic public health need. And it says investments in facilities for the delivery of vaccines or affordable housing in a qualified census tract. So I do think that, I don't think we should look at this funds as something that we are going to be able to fix our deferred maintenance needs. I don't think the guidance allows that. I'll say one other thing about deferred maintenance, and as I said, I share Councilman Kramer's concern. But I think we also have to look at equity across the community. So for example, and I'll just use this as an example, and it's not something that I am suggesting that we fund with ARP funds, but we've heard a lot about aquatic centers in the community. There's one aquatic center, a covered aquatic facility, and it's in my district. It's in District 9. It's in East Louisville. It's in a predominantly white neighborhood. We can fix that to the exclusion of building something new and providing that kind of service in West Louisville or South Louisville, where we don't have any kind of service like that. I think we have to do both. I mean, we have to address the equity issues and provide these kinds of amenities and services and infrastructure all over the community, including where we've disinvested in the past, all while we're trying to fix up what we currently have. And I know Councilman Kramer agrees with me on this. You can't do one and not the other.
If I may join in, Councilman Hollander's right. I do agree with him on this, and I think equity. We should be looking at things through an equity lens. I think it's very appropriate. And again, Councilman Hollander's right. The deferred maintenance need is $2 billion. If we use every bit of this, we wouldn't finish it, right? So I ring that bell not so much as saying we can solve our problems, but just to say we have expenses that will more than swallow this up without creating new programs. Now, that being said, if you look at deferred maintenance through an equity lens, if we were to go in and decide which buildings we were going to fix and which sidewalks we were going to repair, and we did that strictly based on an assessment of need, right? And then you plotted all that out, I think what you would find is that a greater percentage of the money that we would spend in deferred maintenance would be spent in those areas that have been historically and traditionally overlooked. So I would argue that this is our opportunity to look at things through an equity lens and to say, as we try to figure out where we go from here, fixing those properties that belong to the citizens of Metro Louisville, those government-owned entities, very often are going to fall in those areas where folks are struggling the most.
Just a reminder, I'm reading questions that are coming from Louisville Forum members, and there are a lot of questions. I don't think we can get to all of them. But here's one, and let's pose this one to Ms. Handmaker. As the city thinks about investments that have a strong return economically, industries such as arts and culture have been disproportionately hard hit and have had large economic ripple effects. This includes artisans, craftsmen, restaurants, tourism. The question is, how is economic impact broadly being considered on how best to use these funds?
These questions are just a little bit early. I wish we were doing this next month when we had all of this laid out. But it's very much guided by the federal guidance that we got 48 hours ago, I guess. So yes, we're very interested in racial equity, economic development, but arts and culture will be part of this as well. how that will be allocated and exactly how we could spend the money on that, I'm not sure yet. At first glance, we weren't even sure that arts was included until we read a few. I mean, you just look initially at the frequently asked questions and then start delving in, and we still have more to learn about what's even allowable.
Marcus, if I could add just one thing to that.
Go ahead.
I think, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks, there's a lot of other money in the ARP in addition to the state and local aid. And I really hope that we use, and I know other cities are talking about this, some of our local money to make sure that everybody who qualifies for that money knows about it. We get them connected to that money. You know, there's a ton of restaurant money. I hope every restaurant that's been affected in this community is applying. And if they're not, then we need to lead them to that application and make sure they do. And that, you know, that may require an investment of some of these funds, but I think it would be a very useful thing for us to do.
One question we probably should have addressed earlier on is this issue of timing. Obviously, the city will receive 2 batches of this money, the first now and the next May, and must be spent by the end of 2024. Ms. Handmaker, what kind of timeline, if you could perhaps elaborate on, when do you anticipate a first draft of priorities, something that can be presented to the public? Are we looking at weeks, months? Any indication that you can give to the public on when they'll be able to see what the first draft of these priorities from the mayor's administration might be, and also to the council members? How do you all envision a timeline on this going forward?
I don't have a date for that, except to say that I wish it were today. What I think one of the first things will be a 100-day plan on things that we know we can do and can get started on right away. And other members of this team have already been working on that. I honestly don't know the role that the Metro Council has played in that yet, because like I said, this is my 3rd day. But it will be sequenced that way in terms of, let's have some quick wins. Let's do some things we know we can do. I know that we will be running parallel processes on a lot of things, developing the bigger picture, looking at proposals that we will get, but at the same time doing our own thought leadership within a broad community of what would it look like to be the healthiest city in America, and what are we missing from the proposals that we're getting, or what would need to happen if we could increase the median income of our community, or what do we need to advance economic prosperity. So many things all at once, and I don't know when we'll have a plan per se to go to the community, because we won't do that. This will be a big process.
One follow-up: has the mayor's team, the mayor himself, asked you to identify any particular priorities, some of these quick wins, as you say, that could be done fairly quickly? Has he identified any of those and asked you to pursue those?
He has not talked to me about quick wins. He has talked to me about housing.
And what specifically has he mentioned about housing?
Well, he's focused a lot on our houseless population. I look at it as a bigger picture of housing, which includes our houseless population and affordable housing and so forth.
So Marcus, if I could just jump in there.
If you don't mind, Councilman,
sure.
Before I will forget my train of thought if I don't ask her, and then I'll come to you. But just to be clear, when the mayor mentions addressing the houseless population, is he talking about, as Councilman Hollander had alluded to, some kind of permanent supportive housing for the homeless population, or what specifically does he want, or would he like that money to be invested into to alleviate the homeless issue in Louisville?
He has mentioned that in a brainstorming session, but what he asked me to look at is a solution.
Has he asked you to, or has he identified what that solution might be? Because permanent supportive housing is something that has worked in other communities, but it obviously involves, a community conversation about resources and how they're spent. What specifically has he mentioned?
what we've talked about is making sure that we've looked at everything that's been done in other communities and to take into account what works and what didn't work, because we don't want to pursue something that didn't work. We don't want to do some kind of a solution for our houseless project that doesn't support the reasons that they're houseless in the first place. It's more than a structure. So I realize that you're looking for an easy answer, but I don't have one, but we're going to work on that.
Okay, Councilman Kramer, sorry about that. Go ahead, please.
Oh, no, thank you. I wanted to just jump in real quick. Councilman Hollander mentioned housing is one of the things that he felt like, we could all recognize the benefit of, and it's clearly outlined and defined in the guidelines. And I would just point out that I think Margaret's right. This is, Margaret, I hope it's okay with you, Ms. Handmaker, that I'm calling you by your first name.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think, when you talk about those issues that a quick win, I think many of us agree that the way that it's structured, housing is part of the federal government's intent. It's something that we've been working on, as Councilman Hollander said, for the last 5 years now. If you look at this year's budget, as a matter of fact, there's over $15 million in this year's budget for housing needs. And much of that, if not all of it, is projected to be borrowed. It would make sense to me that we not fight over what that number might be, but instead just agree, if we're all in agreement that housing is an issue for us, let's commit that some of this ARP money to be used for that, and let's free up $15 million in debt. And instead of borrowing money, let's just say, okay, we're not going to borrow the money. We're going to take care of this. And then at some point in the future, because again, this isn't it. We're not going to solve this tomorrow. At some point in the future, then we need to sit down and take a really hard look at what our real affordable housing need is. I don't know that everybody agrees that on exactly what that number is. I believe everybody agrees it's a big number, and that the $15 million won't get us there, but it's a place in this year that we wouldn't have to borrow the money.
One of the questions that we've gotten from a member is about public safety. Generally speaking, how would you all like to spend this money as pertains to public safety or public safety related issues? And let's start with Councilman Hollander, please.
Well, the guidance clearly talks about using this money, that it's permissible to use this money for violence prevention initiatives. And of course, we've got some that are just starting in Louisville. So I think that's very important. We also know we really have a violence issue in the community, a very severe violence issue in the community. So I get back to the point as to what we do immediately, and to Councilman Kramer's point, I do think one of the things that we should do immediately is look at whether in the current city budget there is a potential use of ARP funds that would replace some of the general fund that we would currently be using. I don't know how that makes sense at this point, but I mentioned Code Louisville. There's an expansion of Code Louisville in the program in the proposed budget. Whether some of that can be funded with ARP funds, I don't know, but it seems to be within the guidance. I hope there are violence prevention initiatives, not just the ones, the GVI that we've all talked about in the community, but other things that we can think about that potentially can be funded with ARP funds. Obviously, it's an enormous need in the community.
Councilman Kramer, I do want to ask about public safety, but to Councilman Hollander's point, should this current budget cycle attempt to incorporate some of this money, or would that, as your colleague, Councilman Piagentini has suggested, create an issue with trying to pass a solid budget for this upcoming year?
I think there are things that we absolutely should include in this year's budget that would not necessarily create, an ongoing expense 5 years from now. There are kinds of things that we need to take care of. The Reimagining public safety is already on the table. I mean, there's already a good bit of conversation around that. That's not going to be an inexpensive program to put into place. And so, and again, once we've invested in that, it's also not something that has an ongoing price tag that's equivalent to what it would take this year. So no, I think Councilman Hollander's right. I think there are opportunities for us and again, we have to know what the rules are going to allow, right? But it speaks specifically to balance reduction and the reimagining public safety. I think a lot of what's in there absolutely fits that bill.
One area, as you all have all mentioned, there is some ability to spend on water, sewer, and broadband. Can you all speak specifically, and we'll start with Ms. Handmaker, any projects that you would hope in that particular realm could be addressed, whether completed, started, or advanced with this money? Water, sewer, and broadband, a specific provision of the bill.
Right. I'm going to defer to Jeff on this because I think he knows more about it than I do.
Yeah, we have, so Marcus, we have several projects obviously that are in the hopper for the water company and for MSD that specifically fall in that category. And then obviously, I think Councilman Hollander mentioned the need to expand broadband in our community. That's been something huge that we've dealt with through the pandemic, whether it was children being able to access school, workers being able to work remotely, or people being able to access Louisville Metro government meetings. So I think that we have a number of projects where we're expanding our broadband network. Those are the things that Louisville Metro government's doing specifically. The water company and MSC have provided us with a list of projects that they see are priorities for ARP spending. But again, we have to look in total of the total $388 million and how we're going to prioritize that as a community. So we do have projects that I believe would be shovel ready, but again, it's just going to depend on how much of this money do we want to spend on those projects versus some of the other things that we've talked about today. And then I'll also point out that I'm sure most of the folks are aware on this call that the federal government is considering a large infrastructure package. So no guarantees on whether or not that gets passed, but we are playing a little bit of a game as to, are we going to spend the ARP funds that we have now on infrastructure? Are we going to wait for the larger infrastructure package to come down from Washington, D.C.? And so I think that's part of the challenge with the funding that we've got available today, and playing a little bit of that waiting game. So we do have those projects, like I mentioned, but it really is going to come down to how much do we want to, how much is the community going to prioritize those very specific infrastructure improvements versus some of the other needs that we have related to public safety or housing or health response.
Marcus, let me say, there is in the proposed capital budget, there's an $8 million project to expand broadband, and we're waiting, anxiously waiting for the hearing on with civic innovation and technology as to how that would be spent. That was actually put into the budget as a federal funded project. I think in anticipation, obviously, since the statute itself mentioned broadband, it was pretty clear the guidance was going to allow funding for broadband initiatives. And I presume that that's an ARP funded project. So we very much want to know how that $8 million would be used.
And to just finish that comment or conversation, we started on improving high-speed broadband across Metro Louisville a couple of years back, right? I think the program, we called it LFIT, Bill. I think that's what we call it, right? Funded it in a couple different phases. So it's not like this conversation is going to catch us by surprise. We've already been looking at that. One of the things that we know is true is we have portions of our urban area that doesn't have high-speed internet, and it's not necessarily for lack of infrastructure. It in many instances has more to do with ability to hook up to the service and to maintain that. We have other places in the more suburban areas, the more rural areas of our community, where there's not even access. There's not even cable there, right? There's not any fiber in the ground, and so Jeff's right. It comes down to how do we prioritize. And we are looking forward to that discussion about the $8.5 million that's in this budget for high-speed internet.
Well, based on the number of questions that we've received, we could probably make this an entire afternoon, but we do need to wrap up. I'm going to turn it back over to Keith, but want to thank our panelists for a very thorough and insightful discussion, and it's something that we'll obviously be following in the weeks and months to come. So thank you all for taking a few of the many questions that were received, and I personally appreciate your time.